I was already running when the rain turned from a hiss into a roar. My boots slapped mud and rock, breath tearing out of my chest in ragged pulls that burned going in and out. The headlamp bounced with each stride, carving a narrow, jittery tunnel through wet leaves and black trunks. I didn't remember deciding to run. One second I'd been pushing uphill at a steady pace, used to the trail even in bad weather, and the next my body was in full flight, like something older than thought had grabbed the wheel. That was when I heard the footsteps, not behind me exactly, not ahead, just there, matching my pace with an accuracy that set my teeth on edge. When I slowed, they slowed. When I surged, they surged. No stumble, no slide on the slick rocks. Whoever or whatever it was moved like it had memorized me. I knew these mountains. I'd grown up on them, learned their moods the way other folks learned streetlights and traffic. I could hike this trail blind on a clear night, but rain does something to the woods after dark. It presses the sounds flat, squeezes distance out of the air. Everything feels closer. Everything listens. I cut hard off the trail, crashing through laurel and young saplings, water soaking my jeans to the thigh. I skidded to a stop behind a thick oak, heart hammering so loud I was sure it gave me away. The footsteps stopped too. For a moment there was nothing but rain hammering leaves and my own breath rasping in my ears. I swept the headlamp in a slow arc, slick bark, pale mushrooms clinging to a fallen log. A glimmer of water pooling between roots. No shape, no movement. I took one careful step. The step came with me. That was when I realized I wasn't alone out there in any way that mattered. I've replayed that night more times than I can count. To this day, I can't point to the exact moment things went wrong, only the moment I noticed they already had. I'd gone out despite the weather because it was supposed to be light rain and I needed the miles. Living up here, you learn not to let a little water scare you off. I'd told my sister I'd be back before midnight. Cell service was spotty, but that wasn't unusual. I carried a headlamp, a backup light, a knife I'd owned since I was 16, normal precautions, nothing reckless. The trailhead was empty when I parked, my truck ticking as it cooled, the forest swallowing the beam of my headlights. The air smelled like wet pine and iron-rich earth. Rain drummed softly on the hood, steady and patient. I remember thinking how peaceful it was, how the mountains looked like dark waves frozen in place. I didn't feel watched then. That came later. At first, the hike was just a hike. The rain stayed polite. The woods breathed. Frogs chirred somewhere downslope. My boots knew where to land without me thinking about it. I even stopped once to kill the headlamp and stand in the dark, letting my eyes adjust. There's a comfort in that kind of darkness when you've known it your whole life. The first hint was a sound I couldn't place. Not footsteps, something lighter. Like fabric brushing bark. I paused, listened. Nothing followed. The rain filled the space back in. I chalked it up to wind and kept moving. Then the rain thickened. Not heavier exactly, just denser, like the sky had lowered. My world shrank to a cone of light and the wet slap of my boots. That's when the trail began to feel off. Familiar landmarks didn't line up the way they should have. Turns came too soon or too late. I told myself rain messes with depth perception. The woods play tricks. Don't spook yourself. The sound came back, closer now. Too close. I stopped. The sound stopped. I moved. It moved. That was the moment my body decided for me. Running felt like the only honest response. As I crashed through the brush and hid behind that oak, another thought surfaced, cold and unwelcome. Nobody else should have been out there. Not on a rainy night, not on a weekday, not on that stretch of trail. Anyone local knew better. Anyone not local would have parked a car I'd noticed. I whispered, "Hello." My voice sounded small, wrong in the rain. Something answered, not with words, with the rain itself shifting as if a shape had leaned closer. When I bolted again, I didn't head downslope like I should have. I cut uphill, aiming for a ridge I knew would be washed out from the storm. I figured if I could put bad footing between me and whatever was back there, I'd gain something. An advantage. Time. The footsteps didn't slip once. They stayed exactly where mine were supposed to be. I risked a glance back and nearly fell. The headlamp beam showed nothing but rain and trunks and the pale smear of fog. But the sound was there, steady and measured, like a shadow with weight. I shouted then, more out of anger than fear. "Trail's closed! Turn around!" The words came back at me warped, stretched thin, as if the forest had learned my voice but not how to use it. That's when I noticed the prints. Mud splashed up my calves as I skidded around a bend, and the trail flattened briefly. In the headlamp's jittery light, my own boot prints stamped the path in a broken line. And right beside them, perfect and clean, were another set. Same tread, same wear on the heel, same stride length. They appeared where no one could have walked, over slick rock. Across gaps I jumped. Close enough that our paths nearly overlapped, as if whoever made them had been careful not to step on mine. My stomach turned sour. Copper flooded my mouth. I stopped dead, staring at the impossible neatness of it, and the rain seemed to pause with me. The forest held its breath. Then something moved below the trail, out of sight, and the ground trembled just enough to tell me it was big enough to matter. I ran again. The ridge was worse than I remembered. The trail washed out into a slope of mud and exposed roots that slanted down into darkness. I slid, went down on one knee, felt skin tear. Cold mud filled my palms. My headlamp spun wild, catching a glimpse of the drop and something shifting down there, slow and patient, like it had all night. I clawed my way back up, fingers scraping bark, lungs screaming. The footsteps stayed with me, still measured, still calm. I don't know how long I ran after that. Time lost its shape. The rain soaked through everything. My muscles shook with exhaustion. The woods blurred into a single dark wall pressing in on both sides. At some point, the sound faded, not abruptly. It thinned like a hand slowly releasing a grip. One step, it was there. The next, it was a little farther off, then gone. I didn't stop right away. I couldn't. I ran until my chest felt like it might split, until my legs buckled and I fell against a tree, gagging. I listened for a long time, headlamp off, letting the darkness take me back. Nothing followed. I stumbled back to the trailhead near dawn, soaked and shaking, my truck a solid, blessed shape waiting where I'd left it. I locked the doors and sat there with the engine running, heater blasting, staring at the empty woods through fogged glass. I told myself what anyone would. Adrenaline. Imagination. Another hiker messing with me. Sounds carry weird in the rain, but I knew better. I knew because of what I found later that morning after a few hours of restless, shallow sleep. I went back in daylight like an idiot, driven by a need to prove I hadn't lost my mind. The storm had passed. Sunlight filtered through dripping leaves. Birds chattered like nothing had happened. I followed my route until I found the spot with the prints. My tracks were there, churned and messy. But beside them, nothing. No second set. No sign anyone had ever walked there, except for one thing. A place where the mud was smoothed flat as if something had stood very still for a long time, waiting. I didn't hike at night again after that. Not in the rain. Not alone. Life went on. I worked. I slept. I told the story once or twice, usually with a laugh I didn't feel, and people nodded and said the mountains get strange when storms roll through. But sometimes, when a hard rain comes down after dark and I'm driving the long road home, I hear it. Footsteps on the shoulder, keeping pace. When I slow, they slow. When I speed up, they stay right there, just out of sight. And in those moments, I don't look, I wait. Because I know it's waiting too for me to start running again. If this story made you glance over your shoulder even once, show your support with a like, and let me know where in the world you're listening from. The hike was supposed to be easy. That's what I kept telling myself as I locked my car and slung my pack over one shoulder, drizzle tapping softly on the hood like impatient fingers. I was visiting Appalachia for the first time, passing through on a long solo road trip, and I'd picked the trail because the map called it well-marked and moderate. Nothing dramatic, just a few miles, a loop with gentle switchbacks and a lookout at the top. The rain was steady but light, the kind that feels more like a cool mist than weather. I've always liked rain on hikes. It smooths the world out, dampens sharp edges, makes everything feel quieter and more private. The forest smelled clean and deep, wet pine needles, dark soil, something faintly sweet and rotten underneath it all. I remember thinking it felt older than any place I'd ever been, like the land had its own memory. The trailhead sign creaked slightly in the breeze. No other cars. That didn't bother me. It was a weekday, late afternoon, and the weather probably scared most people off. I checked my phone, 1 bar of service, and slipped it back into my pocket. I started up the trail at an easy pace, boots crunching softly on wet gravel and leaves. The canopy closed in overhead, branches knitting together until the sky became a gray smear glimpsed between moving leaves. Water dripped steadily, a constant ticking that blended with my breathing. Everything felt calm, ordinary. About a mile in, the drizzle thickened. Fog crept low between the trees, curling around trunks and pooling in shallow hollows. It was pretty in a moody way. I even stopped to take a photo, laughing quietly at how cinematic it looked, like something out of a travel magazine that leaned a little too hard into mystical. That was when I noticed how quiet it had gotten. Not silent, just muted. The birds had stopped. No insects. Even the sound of my boots felt swallowed after only a few feet. I shrugged it off. Weather changes. Animals tuck themselves away. By the time I reached the first switchback, dusk was starting to bleed into the forest. The fog thickened until it felt close enough to brush against my face. I zipped my jacket higher, water soaking into the collar, and kept going. I wasn't scared yet. Not really. Then I heard someone whisper my name. It came from uphill, just beyond the bend of the switchback. Soft, close, familiar in a way that made my stomach dip before my brain could catch up. I stopped walking. The rain continued its quiet tapping. My heart thudded once hard, then settled into a faster rhythm. "Hello!" I called out, feeling slightly foolish even as I said it. There was a pause, long enough that I almost laughed at myself. Then the voice answered. "Hello," it whispered back, but it wasn't right. It was my voice, or close enough to make my skin prickle. Same pitch, same cadence, only slower. Stretched, like it was being dragged through thick air before reaching me. I stood there, rain seeping down my neck, breath fogging in front of my face, and listened to the woods breathe around me. The fog shifted subtly, shapes forming and dissolving between the trees. "Is someone there?" I said louder this time. The words echoed strangely, flattening as they traveled uphill. When the reply came, it repeated exactly what I'd said. Same words, same order, different timing. It was delayed just enough to feel intentional. My mouth went dry. I tasted something metallic at the back of my tongue. I told myself it was just someone messing with me. Another hiker, maybe, hiding off the trail for a laugh. Sound does weird things in fog. Everyone knows that. Still, I didn't move forward. The voice tried again. It said my name. This time it was closer, careful, almost curious, like someone testing how it felt in their mouth. I took a step back down the switchback. Wet gravel slid under my boot. The voice moved with me, not louder, not faster, just repositioned. Now it was slightly to my right, just off the trail, where the fog was thickest. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I yanked it out, relief spiking, until I saw the screen. No service. The instant I noticed, the rain seemed to stop. Not fade, stop. The sudden quiet was worse than any noise. My ears rang with it. I could hear my own breathing, my pulse. Somewhere a branch creaked slowly, like a settling bone. The voice didn't stop. It shifted again, now to my left, circling without footsteps. Without any sound of movement at all. Just the whisper, threading between trees. I turned in place, headlamp cutting through fog in narrow slices. Nothing. No shape. No shadow I could pin down. Just fog and trunks and the overwhelming sense of being very precisely surrounded. "I'm leaving," I said, my voice coming out thinner than I meant it to. "Trail's yours." The whisper repeated the last word. Yours. Something about that broke whatever balance I'd been trying to keep. I didn't run right away. I backed down the switchback, step by careful step, eyes fixed on the fog ahead of me. The voice followed, never raising itself above a murmur, never hurrying. It spoke less now, content to let the silence stretch. Halfway down, I heard another sound, footsteps. Not behind me, ahead, slow, deliberate, crunching softly on wet leaves. I froze. For a long second, nothing happened. Then the footsteps took another step, and another. I turned and ran. The trail dropped sharply, switchbacks stacking on top of each other like coiled ribbon. I slipped once, went down hard on my hands, palms stinging as gravel bit into skin. Mud smeared my jacket. I scrambled back up, heart slamming, lungs burning cold. The whispers multiplied, not louder, closer, around me, inside the fog, saying my name from different directions, each one just slightly off, like an imperfect recording. The footsteps stayed ahead of me, always just beyond the reach of my headlamp. The forest felt wrong now, hostile. Branches snagged my pack. Roots reached up like fingers. The smell of wet earth grew heavier, tinged with rot and something sour I couldn't place. My breath rasped, fogging the beam of my light. I risked a glance back and saw movement in the fog. Not a body, just a disturbance, like something tall shifting its weight. The trail straightened briefly, opening onto a wider stretch. For a moment, I thought I saw a structure off to the side, maybe an old shelter or a collapsed shed, its outline barely visible through the mist. I veered toward it, desperation overriding caution. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't a shelter. It was the remains of a cabin, long abandoned. Roof sagged inward, boards gray and split, moss creeping up the walls. The door hung open, swinging slightly, though there was no wind. I didn't go inside. Something about that doorway felt like an invitation I couldn't afford to accept. The whispers surged as I passed it, voices overlapping, stumbling over my name like children learning a new word. I clamped my jaw shut and kept moving. The parking area came into view like a miracle. Asphalt shining wet under my headlights, my car sitting alone at the edge like it had been dropped there just for me. I burst out of the trees, boots skidding on pavement, and fumbled for my keys. As I yanked the door open, the whispers cut off. Not faded. Cut. The silence that followed was thick and absolute. Even the rain didn't return right away. I slammed the door, locked it, and sat there shaking as the engine turned over. The headlights flickered on, beams cutting across empty trees and fog. Nothing stood there. I pulled out without looking back, tires hissing on wet asphalt, and didn't slow until I hit the main road. The rain started up again as if nothing had happened. I drove for a long time before I realized my hands were cramping around the steering wheel. I didn't tell anyone right away. What would I have said? That the woods whispered my name back to me. That fog learned how I sounded. I chalked it up to fear, exhaustion, an overactive imagination fueled by isolation and weather. The next morning, curiosity got the better of me. I stopped by the ranger station, a low building tucked near the edge of town. The man behind the desk was older, his uniform worn soft with years. He looked up as I came in, eyes flicking briefly to the mud still caked on my boots. "Trail was rough last night," I said, trying to sound casual. "Fog got pretty thick." He nodded slowly. "It does that." "I thought I heard someone up there," I added. "After dark." That made him pause. "What time were you hiking?" he asked. "Just before dusk." His mouth tightened just a little. "That trail closes at sunset," he said. I frowned. "I didn't see a sign." "We don't always put one up," he replied. "Folks don't pay attention anyway." "Because of wildlife?" I asked. He hesitated, then smiled. "Because sound carries strange there when it rains." The smile didn't reach his eyes. I left not long after that. Cut my trip short. Told myself I needed to get back to familiar places, familiar trails. I avoided fog, avoided rain. To this day, I still can't explain what happened up there. I don't know who or what was speaking. I don't know why it knew my name. But sometimes when rain taps softly against my window late at night, I hear it again. Just once. Just enough to remind me. And I never answer. Let's see where the darkness travels. Leave a like and tell me your feedback. It's been almost 10 years since I left those mountains, and I still dream in switchbacks and rain. I'm telling this now from a place that's flatter, louder, easier to explain. I've got streetlights outside my window and neighbors close enough that I can hear their televisions through the walls. But when I close my eyes, I'm back home, breathing damp air that tastes like iron and pine, standing under trees that remember me better than I remember them. I'd moved away in my early 20s, like a lot of folks do. College first, then work. A city that promised opportunity and delivered noise. I told myself I was done with the hollers and the long roads that went nowhere, done with the way the mountains always felt like they were watching to see if you'd learned anything yet. When my dad died, I came back for the funeral, stayed longer than I planned. The house felt too quiet without him, and the nights stretched out in ways I wasn't ready for. Old habits crept back in, driving aimlessly, sitting on the porch listening to insects, and finally hiking. I told myself it was just to clear my head. The rain started late that afternoon, a steady Appalachian drizzle that never really commits to being a storm. I pulled on an old jacket, grabbed a flashlight and a small pack, and headed for a trail I'd walked 100 times growing up. It wasn't marked on newer maps anymore, but I knew it by heart, or thought I did. The woods greeted me like an old acquaintance. The canopy closed overhead, leaves slick and dark, water dripping down my neck. Everything smelled alive and decaying at the same time. Wet bark, mushrooms, the faint, sweet rot of fallen leaves breaking down into soil. I remember thinking how little had changed. That thought didn't last long. About 20 minutes in, I noticed the first blaze. It was fresh. Bright red paint slashed across the trunk of an old beech tree, the color bleeding slightly where rain ran down the bark. I stopped and stared at it, confusion prickling through me. That tree hadn't been marked before, I knew because my dad had taught me how to read trails, how to spot old blazes and trust them more than new ones. This one looked wrong. Too new, too vivid against the gray-brown forest. Must be rerouting, I muttered to myself, though it didn't quite make sense. No one maintained this trail anymore. I shrugged and kept going. 5 minutes later, there was another blaze. Same red, same wet shine, on a tree that shouldn't have been marked either. I slowed my pace, eyes scanning ahead. The trail beneath my boots began to feel less certain. Rocks I remembered being there weren't. A fallen log I'd climbed over as a teenager was gone, replaced by a shallow dip filled with rainwater. The woods felt rearranged, like someone had taken familiar pieces and shifted them just enough to notice. The rain picked up slightly, tapping on leaves and my hood. I told myself memory plays tricks. Years away blur details, that's all this was. Then I smelled something metallic, not rust exactly, sharper, like pennies held too long in a sweaty hand. It cut through the forest smells and settled in my nose. I stopped again, listening. The woods were quiet in that way that feels deliberate, as if sound itself had chosen to leave. Another blaze appeared ahead, guiding me off what I remembered as the main path. I hesitated. Turning back felt foolish. This was my home ground, I knew it. The blazes, wrong as they felt, seemed confident, intentional, so I followed. The trail narrowed, undergrowth closing in, branches brushing my sleeves. Rain soaked through my jacket, cold creeping along my spine. My boots squelched with each step. That's when I found the pack. It was snagged on a tangle of roots near the edge of a shallow ravine, dark fabric plastered with mud. One strap had torn loose, dangling uselessly. I recognized the brand immediately, something you'd buy at an outdoor store off the highway. Not local gear, not old. "Hello!" I called out, my voice sounding thin under the trees. No answer. I crouched and unzipped the pack. Water spilled out. Inside were the usual things: energy bars, a cheap poncho, a cracked phone in a plastic bag, and photos. Printed photos, real ones, the kind you don't see much anymore. My hands started to shake as I picked them up. They showed the trail, the trees. The same bends and slopes I was standing in now. But the angles were wrong. Too close to the ground in some shots. Too far off the trail in others, like whoever took them had been watching from behind trees. One photo showed me. Not my face, but my jacket. The old faded patch on the shoulder. Taken from behind, just far enough away that I wouldn't have heard the shutter. The date printed in the corner was from that night. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I dropped the photos back into the pack like they'd burned me. My mouth tasted like copper. I stood up slowly, scanning the trees. Rain slid down trunks in thin streams. Fog drifted low, blurring the distance. I laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "This isn't funny," I said to no one. The woods didn't react. I backed away from the pack and turned to leave. That's when I noticed the next blaze, fresh red paint, bright against a tree I hadn't passed before. It pointed deeper in. I should have turned back then. I know that now. But curiosity has teeth, and grief dulls pain in strange ways. Part of me needed to understand. Needed to know if this was some sick joke, some trespasser messing with old trails. So I followed the blazes again. The forest grew steeper, rocks slick underfoot. The metallic smell intensified, mixing with damp earth and mildew. My flashlight beam caught movement at the edges of vision, shadows that slid away when I focused on them. The trail led to a rock overhang I remembered from childhood, a place kids used to dare each other to crawl under. As I approached, the smell hit me full force. Rot. Old and dry. Bone dust and damp stone. Under the overhang, arranged with unsettling care, were bones, not scattered, not gnawed and dragged like animal remains usually are. These were laid out in neat lines, long bones parallel, smaller ones clustered carefully. Whoever had done it had taken their time. I swallowed hard, bile rising in my throat. "Animal," I whispered. "Just an animal." Then I saw the boots. They sat side by side at the edge of the arrangement, toes pointing outward, laces still tied in neat bows. Mud-caked but intact. Human boots, my size or close enough to make my chest tighten. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My breath came shallow and fast, hands trembling as I stumbled backward. My flashlight beam jittered across the rocks, catching something else, scratches on the stone. Tallies, maybe, or marks made by dragging something heavy. A sound came from behind me. Footsteps. Slow, careful, close enough that I could hear wet leaves compress under weight. I spun around, flashlight raised. Nothing. The footsteps stopped. The rain seemed louder suddenly, drumming on rock and leaves. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might crack my ribs. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice barely more than breath. No answer. I turned and ran. The blazes led me now, appearing just when I thought I'd lost them, guiding me through parts of the forest I didn't recognize at all. The woods felt tighter, the canopy lower. Branches clawed at my clothes. My lungs burned. I didn't know if I was being followed or herded. I just knew I wasn't choosing the path anymore. At one point, I tripped and went down hard, palms scraping against gravel. As I pushed myself up, I noticed something carved into a nearby tree. Not initials, not a date. A crude outline of a trail marker. And beneath it, scratched deep into the bark, a word. Home. The air felt heavier after that, pressed in on my ears. The rain thinned to a mist that clung to my skin. I tasted dirt and blood where I'd bitten my lip. The blazes appeared faster now, closer together as if urging me on. My legs ached. My vision tunneled. Just before dawn, the trees thinned. The ground leveled out. And suddenly I was standing at the edge of the forest, staring at the old access road that led back toward town. The final blaze was painted on a tree right at the boundary. Fresh. Wet. Almost gleaming. I stepped out of the woods and onto gravel. The forest behind me went quiet in a way that felt final. I didn't stop running until I reached my truck. Morning came gray and ordinary. Birds returned. The world put on its mask of normalcy. I went to the sheriff's office, hands still shaking, and told them what I'd found. They listened, took notes, asked questions. No one matching that pack had been reported missing. No recent cases, no old ones that fit either. By afternoon, I went back with a deputy to show them the blazes. They were gone. No red paint, no marks, just old bark and rain-darkened wood. The pack was gone, too. The overhang was empty, save for damp stone and a few scattered leaves. The deputy gave me a look I'd seen before, one reserved for people who'd spent too long alone. I left town a few days later. To this day, I still can't explain what I found. I've looked through missing persons reports, scoured forums, asked questions I probably shouldn't have. Sometimes I think the blazes weren't meant to mark a trail. They were meant to mark me, proof that the mountain had noticed I'd come back, that it was updating its memory, correcting itself. And I know deep down that if I follow those woods again, if I let grief or nostalgia pull me back onto that old trail, it won't guide me out next time. It'll just finish the arrangement. The fog came down like a curtain that evening, thick enough to taste. It rolled through the holler in slow sheets, flattening the forest into layers of gray and charcoal, softening every edge until the mountains looked less like land and more like an idea of land. Rain followed it, Not hard, not dramatic, just a steady, patient fall that soaked into everything and made time feel heavier. Sound didn't travel right in weather like that. It sank. I stood at the edge of the tree line with my vest zipped to my chin, clipboard tucked under one arm, GPS unit blinking weakly in my hand. The woods smelled like wet bark and cold stone, with that faint, musty note you only get where leaves have been rotting in place for 100 years. The kind of forest that doesn't forget anything. I'd been a surveyor for 8 years by then. Boundary work mostly, timber tracts, old family parcels that had been divided and subdivided until no one quite remembered what belonged to who. I liked the work. It was quiet, precise. You put numbers to land that didn't care about numbers. This job was routine, or it should have been. A developer had bought a chunk of hillside outside a dying mountain town and needed updated measurements before anything else could happen. The maps were old, hand-drawn in places, the kind of work that meant boots in the mud and long afternoons pacing tree lines. I'd started before noon. The rain didn't bother me at first. It rarely did. I'd planned to finish the last stretch by dusk and be back at the truck before dark. The sky had other ideas. By the time the fog rolled in thick enough to blur my rangefinder, I should have turned back. That's what my gut said. But the numbers were clean. The markers were close. I told myself it'd be another 20 minutes tops. That was the first lie. The trail I was following wasn't a trail exactly, more of a remembered path where the land dipped just enough to guide your feet. The rain flattened it, smoothed it out, made it feel shorter than it was, or longer. Distance got strange. I checked my watch. The second hand ticked steadily. Normal. The sky, though, didn't change. It stayed the same dim gray like dusk had stalled mid-thought. I took a bearing, paced off the distance to the next marker, and frowned. The numbers didn't line up. I adjusted, tried again. The forest didn't care. As I moved deeper, the rain muted everything. My boots, my breathing, even the usual creak and pop of settling wood. The silence pressed in until it felt like something physical, like cotton stuffed in my ears. That's when I noticed the bent birch. It leaned at an odd angle, trunk bowed like it had grown around a stubborn idea. I marked it mentally as I passed, stepping around its exposed roots. Birch trees like that are rare, memorable. 10 minutes later, I passed it again. I stopped, heart giving a single confused thump. Same lean, same scar near the base where lightning had kissed it years ago. Rainwater running down the bark in thin silver lines. I checked my compass. It spun once, then settled where it should have been. "All right," I muttered. "Long day." I told myself I'd looped without realizing it. Fatigue does that. The woods mess with your sense of direction, especially in weather like this. I adjusted my heading and kept walking. The third time I saw the birch, it was darker, wetter, like it had been standing in the rain longer than I had. Something cold slid into my chest then, not panic exactly, more like a quiet awareness that I was no longer in control of the situation. I stopped trying to hurry. Surveying teaches patience. You don't rush measurements. You don't argue with terrain. You work the problem. I took out my notebook and started talking out loud. It's a trick we use sometimes, keeps your head straight when the numbers blur. "Station 12, I said. "Bearing 187, distance 120. The rain swallowed my words. A few seconds later, the forest gave them back. "Station 12, it whispered. "Bearing 187. My breath caught. The voice wasn't loud. It wasn't even clear. It sounded like my own words pressed through wet leaves and fog, stretched thin and delayed, like an echo that had taken a wrong turn. I laughed once, sharp and humorless. Sound carries, I told myself. That's all. I kept walking. The ground sloped downward, then up again, each rise steeper than the last. My calves burned. My boots slid on slick rock. I tried to bushwhack, cut straight across instead of following the path, but every slope funneled me back to it. No matter which direction I pushed, the land curved me back where it wanted me. I checked my watch again. 20 minutes had passed. Maybe. The sky still hadn't moved. I passed the birch again. This time there were footprints near it. Mine, fresh, crisp in the mud, overlapping in places like I'd been pacing back and forth, indecisive. My mouth went dry. I tasted copper. I forced myself to keep moving, narrating everything now louder, firmer. Adjusting course, deviating 5 degrees west. The woods repeated me, not all at once. Not every word, just enough to notice. The rain intensified, drumming on leaves and my hard hat. Fog thickened until my headlamp beam felt useless, light dissolving into gray after only a few feet. Shapes moved at the edge of vision, branches probably, shadows bending. I started to feel stretched, like my thoughts were lagging behind my body. I'd lift a foot and feel it land a second later. I'd blink and realize I'd taken 3 steps without noticing. Disorientation crept in slow and insidious. This wasn't panic. Panic is sharp. This was dull, grinding, like being gently worn down. I thought of old stories my grandfather used to tell, warnings dressed up as jokes, about hollers where you could walk all day and never leave, about rain that held onto folks. I'd laughed at those stories once. I reached for my radio and clicked it on. Static hissed. I tried again. Nothing. The sound felt too loud in the quiet forest, so I shut it off. The bent birch appeared again. I stopped. I didn't swear. I didn't move. I just stood there, rain dripping off my hood, and listened. The forest breathed. Somewhere close, too close, I heard footsteps. Not behind me, beside me, slow, careful, matching my stillness. I turned in place, headlamp sweeping through fog and trunks and wet leaves. Nothing stood there. No shape I could point to, just the sense that something had adjusted its position when I did. I backed away from the birch, heart hammering now, adrenaline finally punching through the fog in my head. "I'm leaving," I said. "Job done." The woods didn't answer. They didn't need to. I started walking faster, then jogging. The path stretched, then compressed. Downhill felt endless. Uphill felt too short. My legs moved, but distance stopped making sense. I started seeing things that didn't belong. A fence post half buried in moss where no fence should be. A rotted shack glimpsed through the fog that vanished when I tried to focus. Faint lights far off between the trees, like lanterns swinging out of time with my steps. I checked my watch again. 12 minutes since I'd last checked. That wasn't possible. My breathing turned ragged, sweat mixed with rain soaking my collar. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped the GPS unit. When I looked at the screen, the map jittered, then froze. I laughed again, this time on the edge of something ugly. "Okay," I said. "Okay." I planted my feet and closed my eyes. For a few seconds, all I felt was rain and my own heartbeat. When I opened them, the forest looked closer, like it had leaned in while I wasn't looking. The footsteps moved. I didn't run, not yet. I walked deliberately, counting steps, forcing myself to focus. 1, 2, 3. The counting came back to me, whispered. I broke. I ran. The world narrowed to breath and impact. Branches slapped my arms. Roots tried to trip me. The rain felt heavier, thicker, like it was pulling me down. My lungs burned. My vision tunneled. The path straightened abruptly, and I burst out of the trees into the clearing where I'd parked. My truck sat there, dull red against gray mud, exactly where I'd left it. I stumbled to the driver's side and grabbed the handle. It was warm. not sun warm. Hand warm, like someone had just let go. I yanked the door open and nearly fell inside, slamming it shut behind me. The cab smelled like old coffee and vinyl. Familiar, safe. I locked the doors with shaking fingers. The rain softened, then steadied. The fog hovered at the edge of the clearing, not advancing. I sat there for a long time before I realized my watch was still ticking calmly along. When I checked my logs later, back at the motel, my stomach dropped. From the moment I'd entered the tree line to the moment I'd reached the truck again, 12 minutes had passed. 12. I'd been walking for hours. My legs said so. My lungs said so. My memory said so. The numbers didn't. I quit that job 3 weeks later, took a desk position. Told myself it was time. But even now, years on, when storms roll in and rain taps steadily on the roof, I lose time. Minutes vanish, sometimes more. And sometimes, when I talk to myself without realizing it, the rain repeats my words back to me a few seconds later, just soft enough that I can pretend I didn't hear it. "Don't hike it in the rain," the old man said, pointing at me with his coffee cup like it was an accusation. "Not that trail." I laughed because that's what you do when someone turns a casual plan into a superstition. Legends make good stories, not maps. I thanked him, paid for my muffin, and headed back out into the drizzle with my backpack slung loose over one shoulder, feeling clever for choosing a trail most tourists ignored. I was a junior in college then, home for a long weekend, itching to burn off nervous energy before finals. I'd grown up hearing about the mountains without really knowing them. My parents moved us away when I was 10, but the pull came back strong once I had a car and a little freedom. I wanted something real, something quiet. A few hours on a trail I'd never walked under rain that smelled like pine and wet stone. The trailhead sat just off a narrow road, swallowed by trees so thick they leaned together overhead like conspirators. A hand-painted sign marked the entrance, letters faded, the wood split and gray with age. The rain tapped lightly on leaves, steady and calming. I zipped my jacket, checked my phone 2 bars enough, and stepped under the canopy. For the first half mile, it was perfect. The woods softened around me. Rain stitched the air into a gentle hiss. My boots sank into damp earth with a satisfying give. The smell of rot and green life blended into something comforting. I felt alone in the good way, the kind where thoughts stretch out and settle. Then the rain deepened. It didn't come down harder so much as thicker, hammering leaves flat, pressing sound into the ground. The light dimmed earlier than it should have, the sky graying like dusk had been called in early. I told myself it was just weather. I rounded a bend and saw the first note. It was nailed to a pine at chest height, paper yellowed and soggy, corners curling. The handwriting slanted and urgent. "Turn back," I stopped. "Read it again." The nail was rusted, driven deep. This wasn't recent, I thought. Someone's idea of a prank, hikers messing with hikers. 10 steps later, there was another, "Not tonight." My laugh came out thin. "Okay," I said to the trees. "Cute." The third note was newer. The paper still white beneath the rain. "Please." Something shifted uphill. It wasn't a sound exactly. More like a pressure change, a heaviness that moved fast and then stilled when I stopped. My skin prickled. I listened. The rain filled everything, made direction meaningless. "Hello," I called. Nothing answered. The woods leaned back into their quiet. I took another step. Whatever had moved circled, fast, heavy. It felt like being sized up. I ran. The trail pitched upward and vanished into slick rock and thorn. My boots skidded. Branches clawed at my sleeves. The rain turned my breath into steam. I risked a glance back and saw nothing, just motion where motion shouldn't be, the way brush bent without wind. My phone buzzed and died at the same time. Black screen, no bars, I swore and ran harder. The thing followed without breath, without slips. It moved like it knew the ground better than I did. Each time I stumbled, it gained. I dove into a culvert when the trail collapsed into mud and stone, the round mouth yawning dark and wet. I pressed myself flat against cold concrete as it thundered past, close enough that the smell hit me, wet iron, old leaves, something animal and sharp. I stayed there shaking until dawn thinned the dark. When I crawled out, the rain had eased. The woods looked ordinary again. I limped back to the trailhead on scraped hands and burning legs, every sense wound tight. A new note was nailed to the pine by my car. Fresh. Clean. It read my name. I didn't go back to that trail. I didn't tell anyone who'd laugh. But sometimes, when rain starts up just right, I swear I hear a nail being tapped into wood somewhere close, like a reminder. I found the spur trail by accident. I was walking with my head down, watching rain bead and run off the brim of my cap, counting steps the way you do when you've been alone too long and need something steady to hold onto. The map said I had another mile before the junction. My legs said otherwise. When I looked up, there it was, narrow, unmarked, cutting off to the right like it had always been there and I'd simply never noticed. That should have been my first clue. The rain was light but constant, a misty Appalachian drizzle that soaks without announcing itself. It flattened sound and softened edges, turning the forest into a muted wash of greens and browns. The air smelled like damp pine needles and old stone. Everything felt paused, like the woods were holding a breath. I stopped at the mouth of the spur, frowning. No blaze, no sign, just a ribbon of darker earth slipping between rhododendron thickets. It felt wrong immediately, not dangerous wrong, not threatening. Just off, too quiet, too still. Even the rain seemed hesitant here, falling straight down without wind. I told myself it was nothing. Trails braid and unbraid all the time. Someone probably cut a shortcut years ago and never bothered to mark it. I was tired, a little turned around, and the thought of shaving distance off my day was tempting. So I stepped onto it. The change was subtle but immediate. The main trail behind me vanished after only a few steps, swallowed by fog and leaves. The spur narrowed, the canopy closing overhead until the light dimmed another notch. My boots sank into soft mud that didn't squelch the way it should have. The sound felt absorbed. I took maybe 10 steps before I realized how quiet it really was. No birds, no insects, no wind in the branches, just the faint patter of rain on leaves and my own breathing loud in my ears. Still air pressed against my face, thick enough that it felt like resistance when I moved. I stopped walking. The forest didn't react. Usually when you pause in the woods, something fills the gap. A bird startles, a squirrel scolds. Leaves rustle as animals adjust to your presence. Here, nothing shifted. The silence held. I felt a prickle along my arms, goosebumps rising despite the humidity. I told myself I was projecting, letting isolation mess with my head. I was traveling solo, bouncing between towns, hiking when I could. Being alone had sharpened my senses, maybe too much. I kept going. The path curved gently downhill, then back up, following the land in a way that felt intentional. It led me to a creek crossing I recognized, a shallow ribbon of water sliding over stones the color of rust. I stepped across, boots splashing lightly, and smiled with relief. Familiar landmarks anchor you. They tell you where you are. I followed the path another 100 yards and came to the same creek, same stones, same bent log on the far bank, same faint trickle of water slipping over rock. I stood there, rain dripping off my nose, heart thudding a little harder. I checked my compass. It pointed where it should have. I checked my watch. Time moved forward normally. "Okay," I muttered. "Missed a turn." I crossed again, choosing the other fork this time when the path split just beyond the water. It brought me back to the creek. My stomach tightened. I knelt and pressed my fingers into the mud near the bank. My boot prints were there from the last crossing, fresh, clear. I crossed again, deliberately scuffing my heel, leaving a distinct mark. When I turned around seconds later, the prints were gone. The mud smoothed itself as if nothing had touched it. I straightened slowly, pulse quickening. The rain tapped on leaves. The forest stayed silent. "Hello," I called, my voice sounding wrong in the stillness. No echo, no answer. The sound seemed to stop just past my lips. I tried to laugh it off. "All right, very funny." I walked back the way I thought I'd come. The path curved. It always curved. No matter which direction I chose, no matter how sharply I turned, the trail bent back on itself, gentle and patient, leading me to the same creek crossing. Each time the water looked identical. Each time the stones were arranged just so. Each time the mud erased my presence within seconds. Time began to feel loose, stretched. I tried bushwhacking, pushing through laurel and fern, ignoring scratches and wet leaves slapping my face. The undergrowth thickened, thorns snagging my pack. I fought my way uphill until my lungs burned, then broke through back onto the path. At the creek, I stood there shaking, breath coming fast. My mouth tasted like copper. Panic nudged at the edges of my thoughts, not sharp yet, but insistent. The rain thickened slightly, enough to blur the distance. Fog curled low, obscuring the far bank until the creek looked like it disappeared into nothing. I stopped moving, listened. The forest did not listen back. There was no answering rustle, no shift of weight, no sign that the world noticed me at all. That was worse than being watched. I checked my phone. No signal. The battery icon blinked red and then went dark. Dead. I slid the phone back into my pocket with numb fingers. I took a few slow breaths, grounding myself. Panic wastes energy. I'd camp if I had to. Wait it out. Daylight changes everything. I found a rock shelf set back from the path, shallow but dry enough to offer shelter. I gathered deadwood, dry where it shouldn't have been dry, and built a small fire. The flame took immediately, burning steady and bright. Too bright. I sat with my back to stone, hands extended toward the heat, listening. The fire crackled. Nothing else did. No animals came to investigate. No distant calls echoed through the trees. Even the rain seemed reluctant to cross into the circle of light, falling just beyond it like it was respecting a boundary. Hours passed, or minutes. My sense of time blurred until it felt meaningless. The sky beyond the shelf stayed the same dim gray, never fully dark, never brightening. My watch ticked. The seconds meant nothing. I spoke aloud to keep myself anchored. "My name is..." I stopped. Saying it felt like a bad idea. Instead, I narrated what I could see. "Fire's steady, rain's light, creek S there." The words sounded small, fragile. I slept in fits, jerking awake at imagined sounds. Each time the silence pressed in, heavy and absolute. No dreams stuck with me, just the sensation of being held in place. At some point, exhaustion won. When I woke, the fire had burned down to embers. The rain had eased. The forest looked normal. Birdsong filtered through the trees, tentative at first, then stronger. Wind stirred leaves overhead. The stillness broke like a spell. I stood slowly, joints aching, and stepped onto the path. It stretched ahead of me in a straight, familiar line. No curve, no fork. I followed it cautiously, heart hammering with each step, waiting for it to bend back on itself. It did. After a few hundred yards, I recognized a blaze. Old, faded. A mark I'd passed earlier that day on the main trail. I nearly cried with relief. I stumbled back onto familiar ground, breath hitching, legs weak. The world felt louder, brighter, messier. I welcomed it. I never found that spur again. I looked for it later, carefully, on clear days and rainy ones. It wasn't there. The trees where it should have been grew close and unbroken, undergrowth thick and untouched. People I asked shrugged. No trail there, they said. Never was. I left the area soon after. Kept moving. That's what I do. But sometimes on rainy nights, I'll come back to wherever I'm staying and notice something strange. My boots. They'll be clean, no mud, no leaf litter. No sign of the miles I walked that day. Just damp and scrubbed bare, like the forest took something back and made sure I couldn't track it home.